Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Shore, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today I'm back talking about a topic I talked about 3 weeks ago or four, about Christian nationalism, so-called Christian nationalism. And the secular world, the media, mainstream media, and even some so-called evangelicals are up in arms about the whole possibility of Christian nationalism. Christians are trying to take over the government. Christians are trying to take over the culture. They're trying to impose their morality. They're trying to impose their beliefs on the citizens of the free country, blah, 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 blah. That's what the fears are. And what I labeled my video in past weeks was the boogeyman of Christian nationalism. In other words, an unfounded fear, a panic over nothing, a tempest in a teapot. But I wanted to talk more in terms of what actually could be a possibility going forward at some future date. Now, none of this is really practical right now and a possibility right now because we live in a secular age, a rapidly declining secular age, I might add, a rapidly failing and falling secular world order. We're living in an increasingly godless, atheistic America and a secular, humanistic America. And so a lot of the areas of our society are failing. They're falling. We look at the divorce rate that's increasing. We look at the number of abortions that are still going up, even after the overthrow of Roe v. Wade. We look at the gender confusion that is running rampant all through our young people, especially at the junior high and high school level, especially among girls. And we look at the just moral perversion that's being pumped out on the internet and being casually viewed by millions and millions of people all over the country. And we can just go on and on and on about the state of our union, state of our culture, and how it has declined, no question, morally and spiritually. And so my question is, what is the so big a fear about interjecting and using Christian principles more in our society when our failing secular society is obvious? There is a failure on the part of secularism to provide a cohesive moral society in our country today. And so you would think that people would be saying, well, in light of the failure of the secular world, let's explore some other ideas. In other words, you would think that people might be open, just for practical reasons, in implementing more Christian values. And as Christians, certainly we should be more interested in seeing more Christian values in our government and in our leadership and in our society, in our institutions. Of course we should. I mean, do we believe that the Word of God is the truth? Do we believe that God's truth, God's wisdom corresponds with reality? Do we believe that if we practice the principles of truth that are found in the Bible, that things will go better? Do we really believe that? Or is it just some pious platitude or some kind of statement of faith that we mutter when we join a church, but we really don't believe it? It's a real test of what we really see as our firm convictions. Do we as Christians believe the truth that we profess? Do we believe that God knows better than any human expert, institution, or our so-called academia or our political leadership? Do we believe that God is God and knows all things and is wise and we should listen to him? So my question would be, what would be wrong with more Christian principles in our government? I mean, there was a time in our nation that we had more Christian principles in operation in our government and at our political government leadership. If you look back in the early days of the United States, you will see the Bible quoted profusely in speeches and even in proclamations in the U.S. government and especially in the state governments. You will hear leading statesmen and leaders in our society talking about the benefit of the Bible and talking about seeking God's blessings for our nation and seeking God in prayer and all kinds of things that would set secular people up in arms today. So we've already had the precedent of a nation governed by more Judeo-Christian principles and moral framework, and it worked out great at the beginning. And the more we depart from those Judeo-Christian principles, the worse things get and the harder it gets to hold society together. We are divided today because we have practically one half of our population that wants nothing to do with God and wants nothing to do with the moral standards that God states in the Bible and wants things run on almost a purely secular basis. And then you have another half of our population that thinks that, well, maybe we should implement more biblical Christian, Judeo-Christian values, but they're not even sure how that would work, and they're not even sure if they want that done. That's where the evangelicals come in. There are so many leading evangelicals that are scared of, I guess, the term Christian nationalism. They're afraid that that Christian values might be imposed or Christian principles might be used in our government and in our society and in our institutions. And that somehow is scary. But my question would be, why is it scary that the biblical wisdom that we've received from God in the Bible would be governing principle in our society? Why is that scary? Why isn't the status quo right now scary? For example, there are people that says, oh, well, if Christian principles are implemented in our government and among Christian leaders in our government, if we get a lot of Christians in our government and in a high court and senators and congressmen, and if we get a lot of Christians, they might do something like the death penalty for homosexuals, like in the Bible. Well, think about it this way. We already have the death penalty on hundreds of thousands of babies in the womb every day that are killed through abortion. So we're killing 1 million babies a year in this country through abortion, and that's a tragedy. And you're worried about the possibility that Old Testament law against sexual perversion might be execution for those who are sexual perverts. You're worried about pedophiles who are preying upon young people, that they might be jailed or they might even be executed for their crimes. You're worried about that while 1 million babies are killed right now in our society under the secular assumptions. And you're supposed to be up in arms about the possibility of Christian nationalism and all worried and panicked about it. Why aren't you worried and panicked about what the murderous status of babies are right now in the secular society? So I think Christians have to really go back to the fundamental principles of what is a society according to God and what is a human being according to God. And how does society, how is it correctly ordered by God? And we have the answers in the Bible. And these were answers that our founding fathers and the people that started this nation took seriously. They quoted the Bible. They used the truth of the Bible in their arguments, in their planning. They did not write off the Bible. They did not see the Bible as some religious, pious writings and turn to the experts at the universities and the so-called enlightened people as the sole arbiters of truth. No, they turned to the Bible, and they also listened to all the other experts, and they listened to all the other thinkers, and they weighed and they considered, and they actually implemented a mixture of the best thinking at the time along with the biblical truths. You have someone like a Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence and saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator. Now, do you think Thomas Jefferson is a Christian nationalist? Do you think he was worried about and feared borrowing from the wisdom of the Bible and using principles that God has revealed in the Bible? Do you think he was worried about that and up in arms about that and say, oh, Christianity is going to take over the country and we're flirting with a totalitarian Christian state and a theocracy? Do you think he panicked that way? No, he didn't. He said himself right in one of the founding documents, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We are endowed by our Creator. Where did he get that idea? From the Bible, Genesis. God made them male and female. He made them in the image and likeness of God. So we are made in the image of God. That's where human rights come from. God is the source of all human rights. He is the creator. He is the architect. If you want to put it in terms of, say, like you might put it in terms of Masonic terminology, a lot of the founding fathers flirted with the Masons, and they put God in terms of the divine architect of the universe. Okay, so that's sort of a bastardization of Christianity, but it is found in the Bible that God is the creator. He is the architect. He's the intelligent designer. You can go on with descriptions about God, but they did not have any fears in the beginning there of the nation about using biblical languages, borrowing biblical truths. They took truth wherever they found it. And the wisdom of God was available, and they borrowed heavily from it. Jefferson borrowed from Genesis and said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights given by God because of our status as human beings made in His image. Among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, he borrowed from John Locke. It was life, liberty, and property, and he put in there happiness. The Bible doesn't have that triple motto, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Bible doesn't teach us that phrase that Jefferson used. That is something he borrowed from the Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and others. But it is consistent with the biblical truth. It does not contradict it. It does not challenge the biblical truth. So he used a biblical idea that we're made in the image of God and we're given inalienable rights, rights that men cannot take away, governments cannot take away. Governments are supposed to uphold and support these God-given rights, and that's why governments are formed, to uphold these God-given rights. And then Jefferson added some more, I would say, more philosophical thinking in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Certainly life is a right given by God. We have, for example, the teaching in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, that if one takes a human life in murder, then the murderer deserves to die. Capital punishment. We have that. Now, that capital punishment is not disrespecting the rights of life. It is upholding the right of life. Because if you treat someone else's life flippantly or loosely or casually, or disrespect their right to life and kill them through murder, your life is demanded of you. That's God's law. That's God's rule. And so the death penalty is a biblical concept. And so it's not humane to do away with the death penalty. No, it's to the contrary. It is humane to have the death penalty so that people realize, look, you have to respect human life because God gave human life. Every human life is worthy of respect and life because every human life is made in the image of God. These are biblical teachings that the founding fathers used in organizing our nation. And our nation has been a beacon of freedom for the entire world. And it was formed on the basis of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, the problem with some forms of conservatism today, even Christians fall into this, is they say that, well, if we could only get back to our founding documents, if we could get only back to the Declaration of Independence, if we could get only back to the teachings of the founding fathers and what they believed and what they wrote about, and we get back to the original source documents, then everything would be okay. The problem with that is we don't live in a population of people who think the way the founding fathers and the population at the time think and thought. For example, there was a general Judeo-Christian worldview consensus in the colonies during the time of the founding of our nation. There was a general respect for the biblical truth. There was a general respect for the superiority of the Judeo-Christian moral and spiritual teachings. There was a general respect for Christian principles and truths. And so there were people, of course, that were outlaws and didn't respect anything, and they were known for that. But even the so-called deists and the so-called, like Thomas Paine and the so-called Enlightenment people, most of them believed in God. And they did respect basic Christianity. Now, Thomas Paine was more of a radical figure, and he didn't like the Bible. It imposed on him, and he wanted free from biblical teachings. But that was not a reflection of most of the founding fathers and the people that found our nation. And certainly it wasn't reflected in the population of the people. They never would have stood for Thomas Paine's disrespect for the Bible, even though Thomas Paine believed in God and did respect basic moral standards. He was a critic of the Bible, and he was anti-supernatural, and he brought in some of the worst of the Enlightenment principles in respect to the Bible. But he believed in God, and most of the founding fathers, all of the founding fathers, as far as I can tell, believed in God. And not only that, they believed in the basic wisdom found in the Bible. So they were not afraid to implement biblical wisdom and biblical principles and Judeo-Christian moral standards in the formation of a new country and society. What they were concerned about was any one church or church group imposing its peculiar beliefs on everyone. And that was the real fear, because in England, for example, you had the Church of England, and it was the national church. And then by being the national church, it imposed itself on its citizens to conform to the peculiarities of the Church of England. And in Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal, Italy, and other nations in Europe, they had state churches, and it was the Roman Catholic Church, and that imposed Roman Catholicism on all the citizens. It imposed it on all the Christian citizens. So if you were a Reformation Christian in a Catholic country, you could be persecuted, and you would have Catholicism imposed on you. And the founding fathers and the population in the United States didn't want one brand of Christianity, whether it's Catholicism, Baptist, Protestant, Reformation, Presbyterian, Lutheran. They didn't want any one denominational brand imposed on all other Christians. And that was what their big fear was, that the United States would somehow establish a religion, meaning a denomination. They did not want a totally secular government and secular society, because if they did, well, Thomas Jefferson contradicted that whole idea in saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator. He's talking about a Creator who endows rights on human beings. Well, if you're a Buddhist and you're a Hindu, that kind of talk is totally meaningless. You're not allowing for the Hindu and the Buddhist worldview to be represented in government and society if you're talking about a creator who can endow rights on his creation. So you rule out the Hindu and many of the Eastern religions right there. And certainly the United States was not pandering to or catering to the Islamic faith. and they don't quote from the Quran. We don't have any teachings drawn directly from the Quran or the unique teachings of Muhammad. And Muhammad is not quoted in the United States and the colonies. And the reason is that that is not something that the population or the founding fathers envisioned as something they wanted imposed on the colonists. Can you imagine if you had Islam here and it imposed itself the way it does with Sharia law in some of the nations of Europe right now? There are certain sections of England, for example, certain neighborhoods and territories where has a Muslim majority population and Sharia law is enforced, and police don't even go into those areas, and they have almost an autonomous zone where Sharia law is allowed to rule. I mean, can you imagine the founding fathers for a second agreeing for some section of the United States to have Sharia law imposed? No, this would be impossible. This would be crazy, insane. So we don't want Islam, we don't want Buddhism, we don't want Hinduism, we don't want any religion that is foreign to the Judeo-Christian founding religion, because the people of this country, when it was formed, were basically Judeo-Christian in their orientation. There's no question about that. That's a historical fact. So what is the fear of Christian nationalism? I don't think there should be any fear, because the assumption would be that if there are Christian leaders and a Christian president and Christian senators and judges, that they would automatically then rush to try to impose their own peculiar Christian teachings on the nation. And that's not true. But they would not be afraid to stand up and say, no, Satanism and Christianity are not on level playing fields. We do not give equal respect to an anti-religion religion. Satanism is basically a inverse of Christianity. And that's what it's all built on. It's built on a rebellion of Christianity. If you don't have Christianity, you don't have Satanism, because Satanism is an opposition to and builds on its antagonism toward Christianity. So that's why they say the Mass backwards, the Lord's Prayer is repeated backwards. They invert the cross, turn it upside down. This is their form of rebellion. Okay, so it is insane for this country to classify Satanism and satanic temples, so-called, as a legitimate expression of religion. It isn't insane that some of these state houses, capitals, have a Christian manger scene there, and then they allow a satanic Baphomet, devil-horned goat, to be situated right next to the creche, the manger scene, and claiming, well, it has to be because, we treat all religions the same. No, we don't have to treat all religions the same. That is a false assumption. And the Founding Fathers did not treat all religions the same. Like I said before, the endowed by our Creator is a direct teaching from the Bible. And it also totally compatible with Judaism and Christianity. Whether it's found in the Quran or not is irrelevant, because this population was not Islamic, Muslim, and it did not cater to or pander to Islam. It didn't. It certainly wasn't worried about offending Buddhists and Hindus by not putting in their sacred texts and teachings about the universe and so forth. No, it was a Judeo-Christian worldview that formed this nation. And so Christian nationalism could simply be if you want to, a returning to a more overtly Judeo-Christian worldview without allowing any particular denomination to impose itself on the country. What's wrong with Christian principles being the governing rules of our nation? What's wrong with saying you can You can be an atheist, you can be an agnostic, but there are certain forms of speech that are not protected. If you go out of your way to antagonize and blaspheme and try to denigrate God directly as a protest against God, then yeah, there should be imposition and laws against that. What's wrong with that? I mean, we have on our coinage, "In God we trust," and if you have someone coming along in a public square, blaspheming and insulting and putting down and swearing and cursing against God Almighty at some public satanic ritual in the public square, why couldn't that be illegal? Because it's undermining the whole foundation of the nation. Because, again, "In God we trust" is on our coins. We have the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And under God, again, we have the references to God. So what would be so wrong with actually saying, yeah, we're defining that reference specifically to the Judeo-Christian God, the personal God. And we're not trying to offend Hindus and Buddhists who don't believe in a personal God. They believe the impersonal powers and forces, but they don't believe in a personal God. We're not trying to offend them specifically, but the nation is organized around the assumption of a personal God. And what's wrong with stating that outwardly, overtly? What's wrong with saying that we respect the wisdom of the Bible and that God is his human rights, the rights that he has given us, will be instituted in our nation? You can't kill babies because they're made in the image of God, and we respect the rights that God has given. There's nothing wrong with that. Why couldn't those moral, spiritual principles be utilized at the highest levels of government and even in the state levels? Why couldn't they? I mean, it's negative thinking to say, well, no, we couldn't do that. Why couldn't we? We have secular principles imposed on people today, and that's supposed to be better? No. So there is an open future as far as how we can improve our nation. We should always be looking to make things better, and there's room for improvement. And I think one of the biggest flaws of our nation was that we didn't come out and state overtly what is already implied in a lot of the founding documents, and that is that in God we trust. And that God is defined very specifically in the United States as the Judeo-Christian understanding concept of God. And that means we're not going to impose it on people. We're not going to make them attend a Christian church. We're not going to force them to read the Bible or pray to the Christian God. But the assumption is that he exists and that we will not implement any law or policy that will contradict his will. And we respect God and we seek his favor and blessings. And that would be perfectly acceptable. The fears that people have are so overblown about this. And I think that we need to really get serious and start thinking in terms of what we will do in the future if we ever get a chance to do it. Well, hope that's been helpful, but don't miss next week. We'll see you back later.